Welcome to Command and Control, a podcast about military command and the control measures used to orchestrate combat engagements and wars. Having been thinking about this for a while, I developed a little theory. My hypothesis is that command is human and control has become increasingly technical or technological. There are libraries filled with discussion and commentary about command, but very little about control. Given the growth in C2 systems in headquarters, I think we need to consider how we effectively synchronise between the key functions of command and control. We haven't had a serious debate about what the control element is since the 1980s. I'm Peter Roberts, your host as we talk to people, operators, commanders, technical geniuses, academics and those from industry who really have been thinking about different aspects of C2 for a while. The show is sponsored by Systematic.
Systematic are the creators of Citaware, the world's #1 C4 ISR software. We've designed C2 systems for the military since 1986 and supply more than 45 countries worldwide. With a heritage built on innovative development and rigorous testing, this is a proven in-service solution based on real customer requirement and tailored to fit your needs.
This episode is about trust within the C2 paradigm. Some of this is between commanders, right? And it's not new. The Nelsonian band of brothers, likewise for the Mongols or the Persians or the Carthaginians. But more interesting today is the issue of trust between humans and the systems within command and control headquarters. This is important as human relationships, trust and training are vital for contemporary warfare. Good battlefield C2 complements this by reducing friction and isolation. But the nature of war is unpredictable. It is, after all, a uniquely human endeavour. Can good command and control overcome this? When peer-on-peer conflict requires larger formations, good decisions must be made quickly, giving subordinate commanders and staffs time to do their own planning. So it's important for information to come in from all levels that allow faster, delegated decision-making. But the sheer scale of information being processed, the sophistication of the feeds, and the options presented can make control systems overwhelming. There's an obsession in military circles about the COP itself, the common operating picture, that has a level of complexity which few humans, and military personnel in particular, have experience in dealing with. Perhaps only 1% of humans really understand the scale and the veracity of the inputs and the processes behind them. Somehow we need to change that to the 99%. AI will probably be part of the answer, but only one part. Overcoming this issue requires a new kind of capability that optimizes user understanding, not just in the current picture, but in future-scaping the fight to come. Underpinning all of that is the concept of trust, still human to human, but much more about human-machine trust than we've been used to discussing. How much do you even trust the systems in your headquarters? How far should we trust them? Does that trust what does it mean in this context? There is genuinely only one person who could help me understand some of the factors surrounding this notion of trust. Dr. Christina Balis wrote a paper about trust last year for RUSI, and she is now the Global Campaign Director at Kinetic. Her 20 years experience across both sides of the Atlantic encompasses consulting, industry and public policy settings with a particular focus on defence, global security and transatlantic relations. Now, Christina has been a fellow at the European programme at CSIS, the Centre for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, D.C., which is the premier think tank in the world, the Vice President for Strategy and Corporate Development at Serco, and Principal and Head of Operations at Avicent in Paris. Christina, listen, I'm delighted to welcome you to the show, having really enjoyed your paper and in many ways talked about it with you before. So let's start with this idea of trust. What is it historically and how does that sort of relate to the military machine?
Thank you very much for the very kind introduction. It might be worthwhile just reflecting on the term trust itself. And when I first started looking at this, I thought it should be straightforward. There should be a common definition of what trust is. Well, guess what? Depending on the discipline or the sector you're looking at, everybody has a different approach. And philosophers tend to look at this very different from, say, scientists or IT experts. And there's a sense that trust has two main components. There is the competent side, and then there's typically the motive or the intention. So the trustor, the one who trusts, usually has to have a reasonable belief in the competence and the motive of the trustee. And, what competence means and what the motive or the intention or the values would be might vary depending on the context. Now, this is where it can start breaking down when we start talking about machines, for example, because we can't really impute any motive and intention on the part of the machines. And some people say, you are wrong. You can't be talking about trust in those contexts. And so trust has always been associated with something that is fundamentally human in nature. You can only have trust between humans, between sentient beings. And of course, we can debate about the animal kingdom and what sentient being means. But certainly when it comes to machine and artificial entities, we don't typically assume that kind of consciousness, if you will. So fundamentally, if we take the traditional kind of definition, understanding of trust, we can see why it is so critical in activities such as the military, where it's probably, as we know, war is one of the most human, vicious, feral activities you can think of. And it's so fundamental, given what's at stake, that trust, whether it's trust at the unit level, trust between commanders and soldiers, if we're talking about the land domain, why this is so fundamental. And it's certainly not a modern concept. You've had it throughout history, as your introduction pointed out. Everyone has always recognized the importance of trust in conducting military operations, but it was always in that context of human to human, whether it is in small formations or large formations.
So, Christina, this idea of trust, historically, we've understood it very much as human to human, right? And we sort of get that concept, particularly in military circles, where trust forms such a central part of our life, whether it's the soldier, the rifleman who understands that the rifleman next to him is going to do what he expects, whether it's a commander expecting and knowing that his sergeants will do what he says and therefore the rest of the formation, where it's the general talking about his formations. There's an expectation, there's a reasonable sort of belief, perception that things are going to run a certain way. We're used to shocks the enemy enforce on us, but we're familiar, we understand the people. How much of that really comes from shared experiences? Because how we build trust seems like if I know someone for a long time, if I've worked with them, if I've been through, a combat experience with them, a deployment with them, I have more trust in them. I might not like them, but I know what they're going to do. I can predict what they're going to do. Trust sort of seems to be built on that shared experience, right? Is that sort of common baseline from where we start?
I think it is one aspect, but I wouldn't put too much emphasis on this, and I'll tell you why. Shared experience, absolutely. But we can have shared experience with machines. We call it familiarity, right? And we know what are the pitfalls of familiarity. We also then start increasingly rely on something that's familiar, which in itself can raise some risks, right? But you're absolutely right. Shared experiences does build trust. And there's one element I guess I should have mentioned at the beginning. In my view, what really makes trust different from things like reliance or confidence is there's a sense of risk-taking. You make yourself vulnerable when you trust someone or something, so there is a risk that that trust will be betrayed. Whereas, I can rely on something and I'm not as exposed, I'm not as vulnerable, right? The risk I'm taking is minimal. So there's an element with trust that, and you're right, shared experiences increases the willingness to take more risk, to expose yourself, to put your fate, if you will, in somebody else's hands. But I think there is something else, which is there's a kind of a shared understanding, which is slightly different. So it's being able to share a similar way of thinking with someone, which is to a large extent shaped by shared experiences, right? So you know what to expect from somebody, and you know the way somebody will think, intuit, act under circumstances. And this is probably the difficult part with machines, right? Because our way of thinking, our way of, even the language I use, think, understand, we apply to artificial agents, but they're anthropomorphic terms, right? It only applies to our brain and the way we're thinking. And that's what I think is quite unique between human relationships. Sometimes we try to transfer it when we're thinking about human-machine relationships, but we are using our own anthropomorphic terms and concepts for that. So we can have shared experiences with machines and with people. I think it's that shared understanding and interpretation that I think is unique between humans only, not between human and machines, at least not as far as we can tell is going to be feasible in the future.
This is really different, isn't it? Because actually we use some of the terms like familiarity and we think that is trust, but actually it's not. you can be familiar with, so I could be familiar with my computer, with my car, with whatever it is, because it acts in a predictable fashion that I sort of understand. But I trust someone, even if they don't act in an unpredictable fashion. It's a sort of deeper emotional response, right?
It is. And this is back to there's something about, again, the way you're thinking, your motive, your intention. I have a different investment in you because of that element. It's not just that I trust your expertise or your competence. There is something else there. But I guess that's, I want, I guess, to elaborate a bit what it means shared experience. Obviously, there are shared experiences that are fundamentally human, right? They are psychologically a very different type of experience than you would have with any kind of machine. I totally agree. And particularly when it's tested in the most extreme circumstances of war. So, a machine will never be in a life-threatening environment, right? You can only share that experience with another human.
And is that the basis of our problem with how we instill trust into machines? Because we're familiar with things, we think about trusting them. When we have a system, we expect to do certain ways. I remember serving in ships, and where you press a button, you expect the missile to go off, right? And then you have a reasonable expectation that, it'll have a percentage chance of actually killing whatever the threat is inbound to you. You sort of understand that. Are we wrong in talking about a trust in a machine rather than a familiarity? Is it really about trust? Because actually, I never had an emotional connection to the command system of the ship I was in, right? I had an emotional connection to the people around me in the room to do their jobs. But I did have an expectation of familiarity and an expectation that it would perform its job in certain ways. As equipment and control measures, like in command and control, they become more central to what we do, whether it's a common operating picture or producing intelligence or thinking about courses of action and recommending things to a commander and the staff. Does that get from familiarity and competence into a level of trust that we're going to need to have with this machine? Because at that point, we're making decisions based on recommendations it's making, not on decisions it's making.
Yes. I mean, I would say that, yes, we will need to have more trust, but the trust can never be absolute. And I think it depends also what scenarios we have in mind. If it is kind of more of a scenario, traditional kind of automation, right? The machine just makes some decision for a kinetic effect, for example. That's very different from when we rely on AI to produce intelligence that is much harder for us to decipher, to take apart, and yet we're using it to inform decisions, right? So how much of that do you trust and how much of that you're going to challenge? So I think, in my view, the biggest challenge will be where AI starts being embedded in so many day-to-day decisions where you can no longer separate where is the human input versus the artificial input, and yet you still have to make a judgment how much you trust that information or the particular data points or intelligence to inform a decision, and at what level will some of those decisions actually be made on your behalf. So, your early kind of hypothesis that you stated, command will be human, control will be AI, it probably won't play as neatly as that, right? Because the reality is there are many decisions that are already taken on our behalf because we decided to trust that, either because the risk is not too high or because the chances of not acting or the probability of something going wrong, so the stakes of not acting are very high, or the probability of something going wrong is very low, that you are willing to take that next step and say, I'm going to trust that particular decision, that input or output. And so in that case, we could say that elements of command have already been delegated to a different entity. And I think the same thing with control. We would probably never want to really give 100% control to an artificial agent, particularly when the impact can be quite severe. So I think it's probably more of a mixture where we're going to have human machine collaboration, if that's the right word. Again, I'm using an anthropomorphic term here, in both command and control functions. And of course, it depends how we define command and control, right? I was actually looking before this podcast some various definitions that were out there. And if I look just at what the US Army has used in one of its recent training circulars, again repeated from previous documents, command is the authority vested in individual for the direction, coordination, and control. And control is the authority exercised by a commander over different parts of activities. And that usually includes elements like direction, feedback, information, and communication. So you could see where all of those things can be shared. So maybe leadership is something that remains human, but there's aspects like decision making under command, or I think artificial agencies will have a key role to make, maybe contributing to larger scale decisions. And similarly, in control, there's direction, feedback, information, and communication. I can't imagine that we would be comfortable allowing artificial agencies to take control of all of those activities. So I think the risk, if there is a risk in there, there's of course a huge opportunity as well, is how do we trust the ultimate output of some of those activities that will be a blend of both human and artificial interventions? And are we asking the right questions to get that level of confidence in the ultimate decision? And that's particularly then the risk when the ability to probe, the ability to write, to ask the right questions involve skills that maybe have atrophied or have never been trained. It's sometimes when we're thinking about decision making, we're thinking about very traditional ways of developing experience in order to inform those decision making skills. I think sometimes it's those areas that maybe we haven't thought of that need to be reimagined or maybe reinvented in terms of what kind of cognitive process do we want humans who are in very senior decision making processes to go through.
So right now we've got more and more technological systems going into headquarters in particular that are taking over some of these decisions. We've been very careful in which ones we've bought, we've thought, lots of different countries have gone slightly different ways, but we're sort of refining what we're expecting. And there's been a lot of testing, there's been quite a lot of familiarity, a lot of discussion with developers. So there's this sort of idea that everyone sort of understands what each other are talking about when it comes to this. They sort of understand the terms, they understand how it could be used. And as they use it more and more, I mean, initially, there was a good degree of cynicism when this stuff came in, right? Is like, yes, it tells me that, formation X is in exactly that place. Yeah, I'm just going to confirm it over the radio, right? But as we get more and more used to operating with them, what we see on a screen, we start to trust and we start to say, yes, that's there. Now, that's been fine when we've had the cynicism at the start. When new people start to circulate into headquarters now, they're just sort of told, yeah, this is the system. You trust it. That's what it is. That's what happens. They don't have those conversations with developers. They don't talk about the same language. They develop a system of trust, perhaps, in that system based on what they're handed over. It's the same way, you walked in to take over command of something. You can trust that chief. You can trust this guy. You can trust that one. They can do it. Watch them. And then you apply your own judgment on top of that. But that sort of thing happens in the human to human interface. We're seeing that more and more as people hand it over to more technologically advanced headquarters. And the drive from military commanders everywhere and political leaders is to put more and more of this automated decision making in there, right? With recommendations and all the rest of that stuff. And it feels like, from what we hear, this is going to accelerate even further, which is probably going to require, I mean, you hinted it in your last answer, probably a different type of skills, a different set of skills from future leaders in how they deal with some of this stuff at headquarters, right?
Yes. And you said something there, which is some of those things we've always had in human relationships. I mean, we all have examples where we just take things for granted because we've always done it a certain way. Your example is like why the formation is where it is. Why not even challenge it? Because we've always done this until somebody says, why are we doing it this way? Right. So, but another basic example of where we lose skills because we increasingly rely on others or technology to do things for us. I mean, think about navigation, right? I mean, we rely on GPS. I bet some generations ago were far better to navigate with maps or without maps because they constantly hone those skills. It's the same thing with children these days using computers. They have learned the skill of spelling because the computer automatically will correct it. And you don't have that experience of learning how to write this, and can be quite difficult, particularly in some languages that are far more complicated, which are not based on alphabets. So I think there is, and it's not necessarily something to bemoan. The world moves on and we need to develop other skills, but we need to be able to not put ourselves in such a potential position of risk where we have failed the ability to challenge certain decisions or outputs, right? So we may not understand the process through which a machine may get to an output or recommendation, but do we have the capacity to interrogate it? Do we have the capacity to ask the questions that will give us the further assurance of whether to accept some of those data outputs or decisions for an action? And it's that critical thinking that most experts would say comes from the most diverse set of experiences and knowledge that you can have. It's kind of range is more important than specialism is what some have referred as, a deliberate amateur. And the more exposure that you've had to different ways of thinking, disciplines, insights, the more likely you're going to be able to frame issues in a much larger context, which is, as many AI experts would also point, that's one of the key shortcomings of AI. It's that framing issue. The human mind is able to frame things in the right way. The machine can't do that. It's a point of relevance. What is actually relevant in this context? How much information, what combination do we put together to draw a decision? And these are the skills that we need to constantly hone in all our leaders and decision makers. And leader is not just somebody who sits at the apex of an organization, right? Increasingly, leadership is going to be lower echelons, smaller teams, dispersed organizations. So anywhere where someone has to make a decision that has some consequence, small or large, involves some sort of decision making. And I think we need to make sure that we all allow our people to learn as broadly and as widely as possible rather than creating just a series of specialists in very narrow fields.
It feels like, and it goes against what lots of people have been saying, right, is we don't need people who have huge experience with coding or AI software development or SDKs or whatever it is. We don't need those people. We don't need our commanders to go away and do a master's degree in coding. What we need to give them is an ability to do critical thinking, to think about framing issues, to be able to apply natural cynicism to machines as well as they would to humans. We need to think about context. But really, this comes down to what you said a while ago, which is like, it's about asking the right questions and equipping people to do that in a slightly different way. Now, you and I disagree perhaps about whether this move towards greater automation, about the blending of technology into command and control, is going to centralize, which is where I see it happening, or potentially delegate a lot more down and have smaller teams able to do this stuff, and shifting the command and control emphasis rather than almost going to a Soviet style centralization on the one hand, which is where I see lots of Western militaries going as they get more information in particular. They have the ability to control more. And the other side of it, which is, I think, for me, an aspiration, it's a way of thinking about command, which the West is far more comfortable with, which is delegating as much down as possible, this philosophy of mission command, of delegating it down to the lowest level. That experience for people, those different experiences that they need, no matter what, they've got to happen right across the divide, right? It's not just got to be the very highest core commander and his staff who have these wide experiences. If we're able to delegate the information right down to the lowest level, they've got to have the ability to ask the right questions. The sergeants, the corporals, the brand new lieutenant out of training, they've got to have the ability to ask these questions as well, right?
Yes, and if I may just go a few steps back, will AI drive greater centralization or decentralization of decision making? I don't know where I stand on this question. I think it could be both. And traditionally, mission command arose from a situation where there was no way that somebody at headquarters sitting far behind could know everything on the ground. And therefore, you had to trust your subordinate commands to do the right thing. And this idea of mission command or Auftragstactic was precisely to overcome the constraints of space and time. Now, we still have space, but the concept of time has changed quite fundamentally in terms of the decision and the pace at which the decision is to be made. And actually, even space has lost its meaning, right? Because information is available to everyone. Headquarters could be as informed as somebody on the front line. Again, there will be always local circumstances that will only be available to the frontline commander. So I guess all of this to say that you could see where a more centralized command is more possible when suddenly you have so much more data than you ever had before to inform decision-making at strategic levels and therefore direct and command forces in a certain way. But you still have that aspect of time, which is, it happens in milliseconds, right? You have to make so many decisions so much faster that I think still the commander closest to it is best positioned. So I think you might end up having a mixture of both, right? A reinforcement of mission command, but at the same time, a new role of headquarters. And I guess headquarters can also be at different levels, right? So I'm not sure whether we can say for sure what that means. And I think the whole concept of command and control, while we probably won't change the term, it will probably assume a different meaning as we start deploying in very different ways and where data starts really influencing decision making at the tactical as well as the strategic level.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because over a period of 10, 15 years, we've seen this idea of how we aspire to command in the West changing markedly based on the information available, the idea of a distributed force, every soldier a sensor, every platform a sensor, every weapon a decision make, all this sort of the language that comes out of it. Then you apply that to something like Ukraine, where it bucks the trend of the advance of warfare as interpreted by or experienced by Western forces, particularly in Iraq and Afghanistan, with a electromagnetic contest that happens, lots of jamming. So you see command and control evolve in different ways. So you see large headquarters orchestrating stuff, but then having very little connectivity to the front line on a constant basis, and therefore far more delegation. And the headquarters becomes a much more supporting role to those in a sort of mission command way that we don't understand. And those that are doing best in the Ukrainian front line are often those who have come, they're like reservists, right? They come from the civilian sector. They have broad experience, not because they're software coders, but because they are just looking at things in a slightly different way. They're cynical in a different way from a military means. They look at a solution being presented to them via Starlink on the latest laptop they have. They get a snapshot of it before connectivity is shut off again. And they make decisions in a very different way than perhaps militarily we think about it. And so I see exactly what you're saying. This blend, this adaptation of command and control is something we need to think about, but we also need to be slightly more open to it than we have, because there seems to be, I don't know if you'd agree, there's been a lot of future gazing and then, pushing down to something that we aspire to have, right? The perfectly, beautifully connected force, perfect situational awareness. And we forget the realities of what Clausewitz was saying about the fog of war, which is this idea that whether it's time and space or information overload or just lack of information or unpredictability of feeds, that suddenly puts the person on the ground in a position where they have to make a decision, sometimes without that support. Now, if you're used to having this technological support and you come to rely on some of this stuff, depend on some of this stuff that future systems give you in terms of AI and ML, whether it's intelligent or anything else, and that stuff disappears, how's that going to impact on people? And how do we prepare them for that circumstance?
No, I think spot on. And this is why we will always need to train people to face those circumstances where they have to think for themselves. I'm being it very simplistically, right? I mean, it's a common expression. It's like people will make decisions in the areas that have been allowed to make decisions to date, right? So if you haven't allowed people to take risks, to make decisions in a certain area, don't expect them to be in any position to do so when something goes wrong. And I think it's inevitable that it's going to happen, with best technology, you may lose connectivity. You may not have access to any of the support mechanisms you tend to have commonly. So you want to make sure that the people on the ground are able to think differently, to think on the fly and make decisions because they've been trained to make decisions. They have tried and failed and they have that experience. And again, that this is not new. I don't think this is where AI really changes that paradigm. This has always been the case. And if anything, we need to remind ourselves that just as humans are error prone, technology will always be error prone for different reasons, right? So we need to maintain that capacity to think outside the usual. And that can be trained, right? It's part of what are the cognitive skills we want to embed in our people. And it starts early on. It can't be when you reach 1 or 2 star. That starts from early on, the ability to take risks in decisions or to take out elements and have that element of unpredictability in your training, for example, so you can learn how to adapt. Adaptation happens during that process. It doesn't happen with the predictable, the known, the familiar. So you have to insert constantly a factor of uncertainty and predictability in what you're doing. And that's how you hone those skills. And that's how you also maintain a critical thinking. when you deal with technology that might seem very compelling, still being able to challenge and interrogate as needed.
I mean, it's fascinating because this is not just a Western problem, right? It happens for everyone. So we know that the Russians are struggling with this as well in their own definitions and how they develop their C2 systems of the future. We imagine the Chinese are doing the same thing. The North Koreans might be investing a little less in technology. But, everyone's coming across this at the same moment. And yet it surprises me that there's not been more detailed research on this. Or is that because I'm just not reading the right places?
There's probably a lot of work outside the military. I mean, cognitive scientists have looked at many of those issues previously, right? So, and I think to build on something earlier that you said, well, we don't want our leaders to all become coders. I think what we need is truly diverse mixed teams. So leaders need to surround themselves with those various experts who will be able to inform different ways of thinking. And that includes, for example, cognitive scientists, just as it will include coders and it will include others who bring different lateral thinking. But I think to the extent that this is not new in the way the human brain works, I'm confident there is a lot of work out there, and there's obviously a lot of literature that we're all familiar with that talks about the way the brain works. And, neuroscience has progressed quite significantly. So there's some very interesting insights into this. It's just applying it to an environment that obviously is quite unique compared to any other. The military has many components that, a lot of people, for example, compare it to driverless cars, right? Because the issue of lives being at risk applies to both. But it's still not the same because the permutations you have in a conflict, you could never have in the case of driving cars. You also, war is episodic, right? So it's not like, let's run 1,000 permutations and at the end of this, we will know how it works. And of course, the most important thing is the enemy's intent, the motivation. That is something that is, again, unique in this space. So when we're thinking about what decisions we make, as we say, the enemy always has a vote. Our system might say, do this, but how does the system take the enemy's intentions and motivations into account? That is a level of complexity that I don't think will ever be close to it, certainly not in our lives and possibly even beyond that. So I think these are the things where it drives an imperative on decision-making in the military that exceeds even those cases in the civilian space that we may all be familiar with.
I'm always reminded when we talk about really diverse groups of people of going across the Franz Academy a few years ago in Stanford, Moscow, and the people they had in the room to talk about developing military strategies and military planning. And they had dentists and philosophers and behaviorologists and archaeologists. It was a really mixed bag, genuinely diverse, not diverse in the way we think about it in Western framing, but genuinely not even the best people from those professions, just people who they'd identified thought in a very different way and were unafraid to ask the difficult, stupid questions, to come at things with a very off-the-wall approach that really broke the mold. And the UK in particular was very taken with the gaming industry for a while, right? So the military desperately involved gamers in everything they did, and they got excited about wargaming, and they got excited about virtual worlds and all the rest of that stuff. But what they didn't do was they didn't take on some of the social scientists who bring, I think, a level of understanding and complexity to some of our thinking that we've really missed. And I would have been far happier had we left the gamers to develop the code and talk to us in a sort of specialist area, but widened it in a very different way and had biologists and virologists and zoologists come in and really start to talk about architectures, even the philosophical discussions that we need to have behind some of this stuff, because we're very tempted to go down the technology area because that seems sexy and exciting. But just where we're seeing the discussions about AI right now, it's far more about the ethics, about the morals, about the implications of doing so in a human form, which we haven't really tackled to this point. I know we've been talking about this since 2014 in think tanks and stuff, but it really hasn't developed with a pace that matches how industry has got on with pushing the boundaries of computing power and AI, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And, when you talk about the importance of bringing those different views and disciplines, it brings to mind this term consilience, that Wilson coined, which is exactly when you have different disciplines, you can have biology and sociology and all of those different come together. That we need increasingly to be blending those things in the way we tackle problems. I think the other thing in terms of, obviously you had now President Biden, Prime Minister Sunak talking about AI most recently, and, we need to make it more safe. And there's increasing talk about regulation. My point would be and we absolutely need to do this. And the focus tends to be quite a lot on how do we make sure that the processes can be managed and the data and we have regulation around it. But ultimately, none of these measures will be sufficient to give us the trust we need, right? And this is why we need to really invest in the human element. So while we need to regulate the technology, while we need to make sure that we put all of those safeguards in place, ultimately, that's not going to be sufficient. And my risk is that we'll get into this space of familiarity and it will become something that we just use and do on an everyday basis and fail to build the institutions and the human talent that can stay on top of those things and adapt alongside the technology. And that is something that I haven't certainly seen being debated enough. What are the skills that our young people in all facets of life, and certainly the military now, we would want them to really acquire over a lifetime. And as you said, it can't be just the digital skills. What is the thinker model, if you will, in a digital space? I don't know that we've thought through that. It's probably not the Renaissance man and woman, but what is the equivalent of that, right? I think to me that's a much trickier question because it requires changes in everything from educational curricula to our organizational structures, right? And what level of decision making and risk taking we allow at different levels of an organization.
And culture as well, right? Organizational culture, which we sort of gloss over in many ways. We don't have a chief culture officer in the military. I don't know a military that does, but you see lots of organizations starting to understand this and putting a chief culture officer in there. This is going to form a big part of the culture and how we adapt that to the future of technology and interactions with it within a decade, right?
Right. Culture is one of those terms I'm always a bit hesitant to opine on because it captures so many different things. And when it's there because you live it. It's behaviors, right? It's not something you can easily capture, but it's everything we do that informs culture. But you're right. It's that aspect. I like to think more of in this cultural, institutional culture, there is culture at the society level. There's quite a broad range of things there. Ultimately, as technology really becomes so central to everything we do, we shouldn't lose our humanity and what is unique in the way humans think. And I mentioned earlier about we have a tendency to apply anthropomorphic terms to everything around us, and that blinds us from what is really unique human and what machines do differently. And even the term artificial intelligence is misleading, right? I think there was a Twitter exchange that's, it said, what is AI? It's a poor choice of words in 1954. And it was a very interesting article by a sci-fi writer, Ted Chiang, in the FT. And he said, I would have defined AI as applied statistics. Now, can you imagine if we were using the word applied statistics all these years instead of artificial intelligence, we wouldn't have those images of artificial agencies taking over the world because applied statistics, let's face it, it's a very boring concept, right? And we're quite cynical about statistics because you can do all sorts of things with statistics. And it's the same thing with AI. It's how we're going to use the insight, the intelligence, quote unquote, that AI will provide us. But in many ways, it is applied statistics using fairly complex mathematical models. We need to put this in perspective. Ultimately, we retain certain qualities and values that are really important. And again, it's about being able to see through the data that any machine will provide to us. And I don't know if it's appropriate in a podcast to give this quote, but you might have heard about, there was a definition, what is statistics, that was provided by an economist in the early 50s. And he compared it to a bikini bathing suit. And he said, what it reveals is suggestive. What it hides is vital, right? So it's the same thing with, they might give us all of this information, all of these insights. What are we missing, right? What is it that could fundamentally affect our decisions and ultimately will decide lives that machines will never be able to really give us that answer?
And if we kept that in the front of our minds when we discussed AI and C2 and trust that we have in these systems, I think we'd be in a far better place to start. Christina, listen, I could talk to you for hours because that was brilliant. Thank you so much for coming on the show. And if you enjoyed that snapshot of some of Christina's thinking, you can find the full report published in June last year on the RUSI website. The show is sponsored by Systematic.
Systematic. Join your partners and allies already using our cutting-edge C4 ISR Sit-Aware suite.
We hope you enjoyed the show. As well as telling your friends and colleagues about it, please do subscribe and leave us a review on any of your usual podcast streaming platforms. This really helps us to reach new audiences and spread the word. The episode is produced by Aurelius Lab as a show for the Waiver Room, the home of intellectual curiosity and challenging thinking for military professionals everywhere. Thanks for listening.